Hi, this is David at Mash IT. Now, following on from our recent X1 Carbon Gen 9 review, we've had a few people in the comments requesting we compare this laptop up against the M1 MacBook Pro. Now, we do aim to please, so tonight we're going to look at both of these laptops. Now, there's no mistake in either of these machines. They're both iconic designs for their own reasons. On the left, we have the new Apple Silicon M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch. There's literally no choice of specs with this one. You either buy it at the 8-core, 8 GPU core with 8GB of RAM, and the only upgrade you can do is to 16GB of RAM, and you can also configure the SSD sizes. And on the right, we have the X1 Carbon Gen 9. This is a 14-inch laptop. Both these are the 1610 screen, which is quite good with comparing them. Now, with the X1 Carbon Gen 9, you do get a lot more configuration options when you are buying it. You can configure the screen that you're using on the machine. You can add more RAM, you can add more SSDs, a WAN card. So there's quite a lot of options when you're configuring these laptops. Now, when looking at both of these, straight away, we want to talk about the price quickly. Now, the MacBook Pro, this is the base model. This cost me £1,299 in the UK. I believe it's about the same in dollars, so $1,299. In comparison, the ThinkPad X1 Carbon cost me about £1,600 with a discount. Now, this is the i7 16GB of RAM with 256GB SSD and just the 1200p matte display. So it is a lot more expensive than the MacBook Pro. So bear that in mind when we go through this review. Now, as always, with ThinkPads in general, or Lenovo in general, there's always discounts. In the UK, we don't get great discounts on their laptops, but I know in the United States or other countries, they do offer some great discounts. So if you're going to buy a Lenovo ThinkPad, make sure you're looking out for those discount codes first. Right, let's compare the two laptops. Now, this will be naturally slightly smaller because it's a 13.3-inch screen in comparison to a 14. So what I'm going to just do is quickly pop them on top of each other so that we can see the difference in size. You can see straight away we've got probably about 50mm difference, or maybe about 2/3 of an inch difference on the depth of the laptop, and the same on the side. So it's a little bit chunkier, but you've got that bigger screen. With regards to the height, if I just run my hands over it there, you can see that the actual ThinkPad is a little bit higher than the MacBook Pro. It tapers slightly towards the front, but even at its most narrow point, it's still a couple of mil higher than the actual MacBook Pro. Now, build quality, the MacBook Pro is a one-piece sort of machined aluminum sort of chassis. It's obviously an iconic Apple design. They've been using it for years. It's had very few tweaks over the years. It's just literally just slimmed down, but the actual style has remained the same. Now, on the right-hand side, the ThinkPad X1 Carbon, it's got the usual soft touch finish, and it's like a magnesium sort of frame. So it's, again, still very hard wearing, and it is iconic if you're used to ThinkPads. I mean, they've kept this sort of look and design for years. Although they've, again, slimmed down and the ports have changed, the actual look of these laptops have remained pretty consistent with the sort of the blacks, the boxy look, the soft touch, and the ThinkPad sort of logo with a light up little dot above the eye. I personally love the look of the ThinkPads. You know, I like that sort of retro boxy look. Of the two, I have to be honest, I actually prefer the look of the ThinkPad. Again, maybe I'm a bit older. I like the retro look of it. I love the soft touch finish. And, you know, it's nice to have something a bit different than the usual sea of Apple laptops that you know, whenever you go to any cafe or anywhere else where there's a lot of computers. Now, I'm going to quickly look around the laptops. So let's put them on top of each other again. And let's look at the ports briefly. Now, I'm going to start with the Mac because it's nice and easy to do. This is obviously the new Apple Silicon M1. There's not really a lot of ports. On the left-hand side of the laptop, you have two Thunderbolt 4 ports. There we go, that's that done. Now let's look at the X1 Carbon Gen 9. We've got two Thunderbolt 4 ports, we've got a USB 3 port, and an HDMI 2 port. I'm going to swing it round to the other side. So the Mac again, on the right-hand side, we've got a headset jack. And then if we move to the actual X1 Carbon Gen 9, we've got a headset jack, followed by a USB 3 port, and lastly, we've got a Kensington lock slot. So that's it for both those machines with regards to ports, but straight away you can see the X1 Carbon is an awful lot more useful when it comes to the ports because you have so many more options. They've both got the two Thunderbolt 4 ports, but I still regularly need USB sticks, hard drives and other bits and pieces, and even mice. So I love having USB ports on both sides of the machine. Now, when it comes to the layout on both of these machines, what I would have preferred, and this is both the MacBook Pro and the ThinkPad, is I wish they'd put a Thunderbolt port on either side. That would make it easier because you'd be able to charge the laptop from either side. And that's one thing I loved about the Intel 4-port MacBook Pro. So we looked at the ports. I want to pick them both up now. We'll just have a quick look at how they feel. Again, both solid machines. The MacBook Pro is very dense. Put the weights up on the screen so that you can see what they both weigh. The ThinkPad actually feels lighter. Again, I think it's a bit bigger, but with the feel of it, sort of the weight is sort of spread across your hand quite nicely. So when you pick it up, this feels sort of a bit easier to carry. Again, because of the soft touch finish, it's a bit grippier as well, so it doesn't slip in your hand. So picking them both up, I do prefer picking up the ThinkPad X1. Now, before I open both the laptops up, I just want to talk about upgradability. With the M1 MacBook Pro, there is literally no upgradability. You cannot change anything inside this. So if it breaks, if it fails, you will be having to take it back to an Apple store or a service center to try and get them to fix it, or you may have to just buy another one. On the ThinkPad, you can change or upgrade your SSD because that's just a M.2 80mm drive in there, so you can increase that. And you can take the battery out yourself and you can replace that. And lastly, there's a WAN slot, so you could put a WAN card in if you wanted to. But if you buy the model, or I've bought the model at the moment, without the WAN card, you don't get the Nano SIM reader, which is a bit of a shame. Right, so we've had a look around these laptops. Let's open them up. So firstly, I'm going to do the one finger opening test. I know a lot of people like us to do that. So MacBook Pro, one finger, and we're straight in. One of the things I absolutely love about these M1 Macs is how quickly they resume from sleep. It almost feels, when you open up, it's so fast, you think it's been on whilst it's closed. It's absolutely incredible. Right, we'll do the same test. Again, this is in sleep. You can see by the light flashing on the ThinkPad. I'm going to try one finger opening. Yep, also possible. And again, this has got the new Tiger Lake processors, and it has that instant resume as well. So that was as quick as the M1. That's a nice feature because obviously on previous Windows laptops, it always took a second or two for that to fire up for you. So now that we've got the laptops open, I'll have a quick look at the deck first and we'll move our way up to the screen. So we'll start with the MacBook. Again, you've probably all seen a MacBook review before, but you've got the aluminium palm rest with a huge touchpad. The touchpad is incredibly responsive and it's probably the best in the industry for laptops. When you're using a laptop like this, with this touchpad, I don't feel I've got a need to actually go out and get a mouse. It's so good. The gestures are brilliant. The haptic feedback is brilliant. It is an incredible touchpad. Now moving across to the ThinkPad X1, we've got the same soft touch finish on the palm rest as we've got on the top and the bottom. I do prefer the soft touch finish when I'm using the laptop because it's more comfortable, but it is a bit of a fingerprint magnet. Also, we've got the ThinkPad X1 logo on the bottom right. I'm not sure if I like that or not, but hey, it's there. And we also do have a couple of Intel stickers. I don't know why we feel we've got the need to cover these laptops in stickers. I would prefer they actually just left them off. Maybe put them in the box so you can stick them on yourself if you wanted to. Now, with regards to the trackpad, feels like a glass trackpad. It's smooth, it's responsive, and for a Windows trackpad, it's really good. I really enjoyed using it. But the one thing I will say is because you've got the buttons above the trackpad for the track point, you've got obviously a more narrow touchpad here. So you do feel that sometimes when you're up and down on the screen, it is quite narrow. Now moving up to the keyboards. Now with this M1 MacBook Pro, they've moved away from the butterfly keyboard, thank goodness. We're back to the standard well, it's called a Magic keyboard. It is a very good keyboard. I love typing on this keyboard. I've been using them for a couple of years now, and they're great. But it pales in comparison to the ThinkPad keyboard. If you're doing a lot of typing, this is hands down my favourite keyboard style. The feel of it, the concaved and curved keys, the layout, everything is just find absolutely brilliant on the actual ThinkPad laptop. Now with the X1 Carbon Gen 9, they have reduced the travel a little bit, so it's a little bit more shallow. It's more similar to the travel on the MacBook Pro, but it's still a fantastic feeling keyboard. They've both got white backlighting. The MacBook Pro has more stages to adjust the backlight, whereas the ThinkPad, you've only got 3 stages of backlight, but they're both very good and very legible in the dark. And lastly, on the ThinkPad, we've got the track point, which I mentioned the buttons of a second ago. Again, this is an iconic feature of a ThinkPad. I personally don't use this enough, and I should probably try and push myself into using it more. Because if you're typing, it's nice that you've got it right there under your fingertips. So rather than having to move your hand away to the touchpad, you can use this little nub here to control it whilst you're typing, and your thumb on the buttons. It's a great way. It's definitely a more ergonomic way to access the pointer whilst you're typing. Now both of these machines have some up-firing speakers. The The ThinkPad has downfired speakers as well, and I'm going to just quickly compare the two so that you can see what they sound like. Okay, so we're just going to test the inbuilt speakers now on both of these laptops. They're both set to 50% audio, and I'm running some royalty-free music from YouTube. So let's start with the MacBook Pro. Then over to the X1 Carbon. Now I'm going to go back to the MacBook and I'm going to lift the speakers up because they are quite quiet. Just about 80%. Now I'm going to do the same for the Carbon at about 80%. Well, that is quite a turn up for the books. I never thought I'd see the day where a ThinkPad would have pretty much better or certainly louder speakers than the MacBook. Now the MacBook Pro speakers sound very good. They've got good separation and it's very clear audio, but they are quite quiet, as you can hear when I'm comparing the two. Now the ThinkPad is probably not quite as good sound quality as the MacBook Pro, but it's an awful lot louder. It certainly fills the room a lot better. Now above the keyboard on the MacBook Pro, we've got the touch bar. Love it or hate it, it's still here at the moment. If you don't like the touch bar, you can buy the MacBook Air, which has very similar performance to the MacBook Pro, but has function keys. But if you do want the touch bar, you need the MacBook Pro. Now, it is customizable. I don't mind it, but I do prefer function keys. But I've learned to live with it as I've had MacBook Pros for a few years. What they have done in the sort of more recent versions of the MacBook Pro is they've now put a dedicated escape key, which is much better. And on the right-hand side, you've got the Touch ID, which is a great way to log you in. If we move across to the ThinkPad, we've got a power button over here with a fingerprint reader in it. It's also great that it can do it at a pre-boot level, so you can set it up so when you turn your machine on with your finger, it will boot the machine and automatically log you on. That's a really nice feature, I do like that. And if you're not keen on fingerprint readers, you've also got the Windows Hello camera, which has been really accurate in my testing so far. Moving up to the screens, we'll look at the bezels first. You can see that obviously the MacBook Pro hasn't been redesigned for a few years and it has got slightly chunkier bezels. Once you use the machine, I don't really notice bezels, so it's not something that ever bothers me, but a lot of people do think it looks a little bit dated because of that. And if we move over to the X1 Carbon Gen 9, the bezels are smaller, but there's certainly no infinity bezels that you've got in like the XPS range. But again, this isn't something that ever bothers me, but a lot of people do notice this. Now with regards to the screens itself, the MacBook Pro has a 13.3-inch Retina display. It's a glossy screen with great brightness, about 500 nits. Now the resolution is 2560 by 1600, which is what they consider Retina. It's a good middle ground resolution in that everything looks incredibly crisp, but you don't get the same hit on battery life that you would do with a 4K display. This is something that Apple have been doing for a few years now, and it works really well. And in day-to-day usage, I love the screen. It's brilliant. It's got a good anti-reflective coating on it, so although it is glossy, you can still use it in a reasonably bright room without it glaring at you. And because it is so bright, you can get away with a bit of reflection as well. The colours are great, and as I say, the Retina display works well with the scaling, so it's a really lovely screen to use. Now on the ThinkPad, there's a couple of screen options. I have chosen the 1200p matte screen display. Now this is 1920 by 1200, so a slightly lower resolution than the MacBook Pro. The benefit on that with regards to Windows laptops is having that 1200p matte display is great for like minimizing reflections and working outdoors, and also it gives you better battery life. If you get the 4K version of this laptop, although the screen display will look a lot better, you will lose a few hours of battery life. Now as I said, it's a matte screen, it's 400 nits of brightness. Because it's matte, it's great. You can work on it in outdoors as long as it's not too bright. And being slightly larger at 14 inches, I find it a great productive screen to work on. It is only 1200p, but this is only a 14-inch laptop, so I don't find that I'm really noticing pixels, but it's not quite as crisp as when you're looking at something on the Retina display. Now, as we come to the top of both these machines, we've got the webcams and the microphones. This is what they look and sound like. So this is a test of the webcam and the microphones on the MacBook Pro 13. And now this is a test of the X1 Carbon Gen 9 in the same lighting and the same conditions. And also, as I mentioned earlier on the ThinkPad, we do have Windows Hello, which is a great way to log yourself in. You literally lift the lid of the laptop. If you're in front of it, it will log you straight in. Really convenient. What you also have on the ThinkPad is a Think Shutter. If you click that across, you can lock out your camera. Quite a nice feature if you don't want anybody accessing your camera. But if you do lock the camera out, you won't be able to use Windows Hello. But as I say, you've also got the fingerprint reader, so you've got that backup there. So now we're going to take a quick look at performance with both of these laptops. I want to start with the Apple Silicon MacBook Pro. You've probably already seen how good these CPUs are, but just in case you haven't, this little chip will run maxed out at about 30 watts, but yet will outperform pretty much every Intel or Ryzen laptop CPU out there. It's quite an incredible chip. Now, as I'm talking through this section, I'm going to put some benchmarks up so that you can see how much better it is than the Tiger Lake CPU in this X1 Carbon. Not only is it incredibly efficient at 30 watts, it's almost passive because although there is a fan in the MacBook Pro, it almost never comes on. Only on an extended render or at the end of this Cinebench R23 test do you even hear the fan, but it's not even loud. Plus, it never gets hot on the top or the bottom of this laptop. It is a truly incredible processor, and Apple really have sort of broken the mold with this chip. But we can't write the Tiger Lake off yet because it's a big improvement over the Intel 10th gen CPUs. This will still run all of your tasks really well. If it wasn't for the Apple Silicon chip, everybody would be praising these Tiger Lake CPUs now. So scores-wise, it does very well in the single-core benchmarks and pretty well in multi-core benchmarks. It will handle all of your day-to-day software with ease. The only area I'd say that I'd definitely recommend the M1 MacBook over something like a Tiger Lake or even a Ryzen is extended render times for videos. So if you're exporting 4K videos or some heavy 1080p videos, it will do it so much faster, cooler and quieter on the MacBook, then you might want to consider this over any of the Intel processors if that's your workflow. But if you're coding, if you're using day-to-day Office, Excel, a bit of 3D modeling, both these laptops will suit you absolutely fine. So we focus heavily here on the MacBook Pro M1. I want to just focus on the X1 Carbon Gen 9 for a minute. This has got the i7 Tiger Lake CPU in there, the 1165G7. Obviously, it's much better than the 10th gen. The graphics are much improved with this actual CPU over the previous gen. And it's also not a particularly loud laptop. I've been really quite impressed with it. It does heat up a little on the keyboard, but only warm. It's never too hot that it's going to bother your fingers. And you can hear the fan, but it's certainly not loud like a gaming laptop. So all in all, if you buy this laptop and you want a Windows machine, you'll be pleasantly surprised with the performance, I think, and the noise and heat on this X1 Carbon Gen 9. Now, something I want to just briefly talk about as well, because it's something that we don't often mention but is very important, is performance on battery. Now, with the MacBook Pro, as Macs have usually always been, if you unplug it, you get the same performance as you do as if you were sort of plugged in. That's incredible, and especially with these M1 chips, because they're so power efficient, you have no problems at all. With the X1 Carbon, once you unplug it, you may need to muck around with the power profiles. Now, if you put this laptop in the max performance mode whilst on battery, you're getting over 80% of its mains performance whilst on battery. Now, that's quite a good feat for a Windows laptop because very often you unplug the laptop and you're going to lose quite a lot of performance. With this one, it's right up there almost as if it's plugged in, so that's quite impressive. But obviously, if you've got it in that high performance mode, you will drain the battery a lot faster. So whilst we're onto that subject, let's quickly talk about battery life. Now, this MacBook Pro, the battery life on this is absolutely phenomenal. It's anywhere between 15 hours to 20 hours on light use, sort of very light use. And if you're heavily using this laptop, you're still going to get probably, I'd say, 8+ hours, depending on the sort of task you're using. So you easily get at least one workday, possibly two, depending on the task you're doing. This has absolutely revolutionised sort of laptops at the moment. It almost feels like you're using a tablet when you're using these MacBook Pro M1s because the battery life is so incredible. That said, the Tiger Lake powered X1 Carbon Gen 9, the battery life is still great. You're getting 10 hours of sort of Wi-Fi streaming of music, an easy 10 hours as well. You know, I shut it off and I think I still had about 10% battery left. And I'm getting probably a good 6 hours of sort of moderate to heavy use on this laptop. So it could probably quite easily last you the workday on battery. Plus with both of these, because they are USB-C powered, you can use power banks to keep them going as well, which is always quite handy. So let's quickly look at the actual charges that you get with each of these. Now for the Apple, you've got a 61 watt USB-C charger. It's quite a chunky charger, but the one good thing about it is the actual USB-C cable can be detached from the charger. So that's quite nice. If you damage the cable, it's very easy to replace it. So that's one thing I do like about the Apple. And we've got a 65 watt charger for the X1 Carbon. Again, it's a USB-C charger, but on this one, you've got a cable that plugs into the actual PSU, which gives you a better length from the plug socket to the laptop. It's also quite slim because it hasn't got the plug built into the actual PSU. So I think I do actually prefer the Lenovo charger. So if I just compare the two together so that you can see. But both of these are pretty compact and easily slip into your bag. Now, just before I move on to the conclusion, the last thing I want to talk about is just the actual usability of both these machines. Sort of the MacBook Pro has only got the 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. Again, it's quite useful. But the only one limiting factor that you've got with this is you can only have one external display. And that's something I think is a bit of a sort of a shame and a limitation with the actual MacBook Pro. With the ThinkPad X1, you've got 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports and you've got an HDMI 2 port. So you can have up to 4 displays running on this actual X1 Carbon. So you've got a lot more options with the ThinkPad X1. So obviously we know the performance is a lot better with the MacBook Pro, but you can't just write off the ThinkPad X1 Carbon just on a performance basis. When it comes to usability, this is definitely more flexible. And the fact that we do have the USB 3 ports as well, which is something that I absolutely love having on a laptop. Also, the ThinkPad X1 is very rugged and tested to military standards. And if you drop both of these laptops, my money would be on the ThinkPad X1 still working at the end of it and the MacBook Pro shattering on the floor. Okay, to the conclusion. Looking at both these laptops together, I love both of these machines. They are both fantastic. Obviously, if you prefer one OS over the other, then that's going to sway your decision anyway. But if you're not bothered by the operating system you're using, so you're equally happy with Mac or your actual Windows, or even Linux if you've got the ThinkPad, it's a more difficult choice between these two laptops. The plus points for the MacBook Pro, it's a solid package, great display, the battery life is phenomenal, the performance is really good on mains and on battery, and it never gets hot and it never gets loud, and these are all great features in a laptop. And also it has an amazing trackpad. It makes it a really good all-around package, and probably a package I'd recommend to most people. But the X1 Carbon, it's got that amazing keyboard. I absolutely love the ThinkPad keyboards. It's more flexible with much more ports. You have more displays. You could have an eGPU all plugged into this laptop to boost its performance. You could upgrade the SSD yourself, and it's going to be very rugged, being a ThinkPad that is well and truly tested. It makes it a much more difficult decision. Now, because I sort of work in IT, I'm often out on sites, I would always personally choose something like the actual ThinkPad for myself, just because I love having those ports and I love having the flexibility. I also like the fact that I can have multiple monitors and I can run Linux, or I can easily just change out my SSD if I wish. So for me, the win has to be the ThinkPad X1. But for a general consumer, for most people that are just starting out, just want a single sort of daily browsing PC, I would have to recommend them to go for the MacBook Pro. It is a really solid package, and that battery life and that performance in this package, and also the price this comes in at as well, far exceeds what you're getting with the ThinkPad X1. Well, what do you think of both of these laptops? I'd love to know what your thoughts. Please let me know down in the comments down below. And if you've got any questions about either of these machines, or if you think I didn't cover anything, please ask in the comments and I will get back to you. Now, we will be doing plenty more videos on these laptops, and we've got lots more laptops coming in. So if you could subscribe and hit the like and the notifications bell, that would really be appreciated, because it does help us sort of grow the channel and get more laptops in to review for you. And lastly, thank you for watching.